Well, I first became aware of classical guitar music when a friend of mine in high school, when I was in 10th grade, invited me over to hear his records after school. And I heard Andre Segovia and Julian Bream, and it knocked my socks off. So I just became enwrapped with that sound, and I would listen to those recordings, and it was such a great feeling. And then I decided I had to actually participate in that. I had to have a guitar. I had to make that sound or come close to that. And back then, in our country, there just wasn't much in the way of quality guitars, classical guitars, and I couldn't afford them anyway, so I was 16. And we did get a couple of inexpensive ones that were imported from Mexico. And they did play, and we did make music, and we had a good time, and it fulfilled that need for me for a long time to feel connected to that sound. And we learned a lot of American folk songs in those days. This was 1960 to 64 or so that I played with him. And that did it for a long time. And then one day when I was 20, this same friend invited me into to go with him to a luthier's workshop. He thought he would order a guitar. And this was new because prior to this time there wasn't a workshop in Detroit, Michigan. But I went in with him, and as soon as I walked into that place, I knew something important had happened because I just could feel it. The smells and the sights and the sounds and all the tools, the components of instruments. And I just became very enwrapped with the idea of making a guitar. And then when I heard them, the quality was so much better than what I was used to that I just had to somehow figure out how to make them, because it let me know, I realized at that time that you could actually have something to say about how they sounded. And so I asked for an apprenticeship, and I was refused. He didn't have the time, and he didn't have the work or the space. This was Richard Schneider in Detroit, Michigan at the time. And at the same time, Richard liked to hear me play his guitars. So I would come in, I'd time my visits about every 2 months or so, and he'd have a new guitar, and I'd play them. And I'd get to play them, he'd get to hear them. And that went on for about 2 years, and one day I was in the shop playing, and he looked up and he said, "Are you still interested in that apprenticeship?" And I just about fell off the stool, and I said, "Man, I thought you'd never ask." And so we had a gentleman's agreement from that point on that if any time he felt I wasn't up to it, I'd bow out gracefully, and if no matter what potential he thought I had, if I wasn't feeling into it, then I could bow out gracefully too. So this went on for about 6 years. I worked with Richard for 6 years, and it was because I'd finished the apprenticeship, as it were, in less than 2 years, but I didn't have another shop to go to. I didn't have a way to set up a profession, so he had the work for me to do. He didn't like doing repairs, and I did a lot of repairs for him. And this was a nice sort of symbiotic relationship for several years, and then at the end of 6 years or so, by then I was married, I had a child, I had to set up a shop and bring in some income. And so I set up a shop in Detroit with a music store. They had a second story, and they rented it out to me, and my partner at that time was John Mello, another luthier who was working with Richard also, but Richard, he came in and visited Richard for the last year that I was there, was his first year. So when I left, he left and finished his apprenticeship with me and sort of became my unofficial first apprentice. Anyway, we set up shop together for a year and a half and got enough wherewithal to rent a U-Haul and move out west. And John went to the Bay Area and I came to Portland, Oregon. That was in 1973. And I had a shop here in Portland for all that time until the present, different locations. But over the first few years, I ended up with about 4 full-time apprentices. They were with me for a couple of years each. And then at that next next step would be to move from a public walk-in space downtown to my home, where the attached garage became the shop, and I had apprentices one at a time. And they would still be at a 2-year stint, but only one at a time. And this went on for a few years, and then toward the end of 1978-9, I became divorced, and toward the end of that summer I went to one of the Guild of American Luthiers conventions, which was held in Boston at Boston University. And that's where I met Cindy Burton, who became eventually my partner and French polisher. Cindy had made an instrument under Bill Cumpiano back in Massachusetts, and we connected over the same ideal of the sound that we were after, that 1937 Hauser that Segovia owned. That was at the core of it, and that commonality drew us together initially. We, over the course of the next year, corresponded frequently, and Cindy made a couple more guitars based on the Hauser design. Now, I made full-scale drawings that you could replicate a Hauser with. It had all the specifications because I had inspected them, and I can tell you a little story about how that happened. Is I was lucky in that Michael Lorimer, back in the early 70s, was visiting Portland and performing here, and he was gracious enough to critique my guitars for me. Now, I was building guitars based on the design that Schneider taught me, which was what he was taught by Juan Pimentel in Mexico City. And that was not based strictly on the European design. It was close, but not there. And it was more suited to the Mexican indigenous music there, the folk music of that culture. But it didn't have all the responses and balances that you're after in the European design, that aesthetic. And so when I became aware of that, I had to take a look at those guitars. I didn't know that Segovia was playing a Hauser. I didn't know that there was a difference in the European design, until Michael Lorimer pointed me in the direction of this friend of his who owned 2 Hauser guitars, a 1943 and a 1948. And he wrote a letter of introduction. I went down to LA. This lady, Dorothy, was gracious and welcoming, and she put me up in her home for 3 days and let me use her big dining room table as my workshop. And I just laid the guitars out on there, and I documented them very thoroughly. I traced them, I took pictures, I took measurements, and in the middle of all of that, I mused out loud to myself that wouldn't it be great if we had x-rays of this? We could see so much more that we can only glean looking through lights and mirrors in the sound hall. And she had heard that. And Dorothy was a teacher. In fact, I think she taught both Michael Lorimer and Chris Parkening in their youth. And she made a phone call to one of her students who was a radiologist at LA General. And she came in and she said, let's go, grab a guitar. So we each grabbed one of the guitars and we went down to LA General and walked in. He met us at the door and escorted us in through the winding hallways of the hospital and toward the radiology department. And as we went through the hallways, we could see in the radiology department all these people lined up on both sides of the hall waiting to be taken care of. And I started to feel kind of guilty about cutting to the front of the line with guitars. And I expressed this to this fellow, this friend of Dorothy's, and he said, oh, don't worry, we're going to go to a room that has obsolete equipment. We're going to get rid of them, and so it's okay, we can use them, and it's not putting anybody out. And so we went ahead with it. And he had a few other people. There was a team of people in there, and we started taking these x-rays of both instruments. Now the machines took a circular image about this diameter, so you couldn't get the whole top or the whole back. You had to take it in two shots. So both of these guitars were getting this treatment of the top and the back and the sides, and in the middle of that there was a shift change. Some of the people had to leave technicians, and new ones came in, and Dorothy's friend was one of the ones that left. And we're towards the end now of taking of the big session, getting all the images. And in walks an elderly gentleman in a big lab coat, and he's looking pretty stern, and he says, "What's going on here?" And everybody just froze. Everything just stopped, and nobody said anything. And so it was getting a little awkward. So I introduced myself, and I introduced Dorothy, and I introduced the guitars, and I told him why it was very important historically that these instruments were really important, and what we might glean from these x-rays would tell us a lot. And he said, "Well, let me see." And he grabbed one of the films and he stuck it up on the light box, and it happened to be one of the top of the guitar with mostly lower bowed. And he started looking at it and studying it, and I came up and I started pointing out things that I could see where you could tell that the bracing was all quarter cut and straight grained, and you could tell that the layout of all the braces and how there's sort of a skeletal image, skeletal support. If you think of the top and the back and the sides as a skin, it's stretched over this frame. And all the joinery was very exact. There was very little glue squeeze out. And you could tell that the glue that was used was organic hide glue, because hide glue is made with hooves and hide and bone, and it has calcium in it, which shows up like bone on an x-ray. So you could see in the cuts on the kerfs in the lining, for example, these little white spots, then that was the glue squeeze out. So he became pretty interested in all this sort of stuff, and then he said, okay, he turned to a technician, he said, "Make a set for the department." And he turned around and left. And he went to the door, he got to the door, he turned around, he looked right at me, and he said, "This never happens." So that was in 1975. And I, from that, drew full-scale plans that with the documentation I had and the photographs and the x-rays, I was able to be very detailed and exact. And those were the plans that Cindy used when I gave her those set of plans after we met, so she could make guitars based on those as I was. And I've been using that plan since then until 1990, when I decided to go to try an open harmonic bar design. Now, the open harmonic bar design existed already. It had been around at least since 1854, when Torres made La Leona in I think 1856 maybe, and it's FE04. And that has one open harmonic bar below the sound hole, and it had a Tonewood, so it's a different application, a different design, but the notion of the open harmonic bar was there, and different makers have tried it throughout history. Very famously Boucher, and then Hauser tried it too. A lot of people don't know that, but in 1930 he made a version that had all three transverse bars with harmonic, with the apertures in them, no Tonewods, and the Torres 7 fan braces in 1930, and that was the guitar that Romanios based his 1973 guitar that Aunt Julian Breen had. Now that's the guitar, that guitar knocked my socks off too. I loved that guitar, the sound of that instrument. So I wanted to try that design, but I was afraid because I had seen very many instruments with these apertures, you know, the Bouchers, Ramirez, other makers that where they fractured, the top fractured over those areas that were not supported in the waist and the upper bout, and I didn't want to have that happen to my guitar, so I just didn't try it for many, many years. But in 1990 I finally decided to take the plunge, and I came up with a design that avoids that risk. This is the open harmonic bar. You can see the apertures in them, the daylight going through. I don't know if you can pick it up, but you can also see that there's very slender little slips of wood underneath there. It's like a footprint of where the brace would be if it was solid. And it's only 0.5 millimeter thick, 20 thousandths. So it's very, very slight. It won't inhibit the tops from working, which is the whole point of these openings in the first place. So then I decided to incorporate that into the design, and I did some other changes, and I've been working with this design ever since. Right. Now, when Cindy and I got together, she started doing French polishing on both of our guitars, and her version it evolved. She tried different things. She experimented for quite a while, actually, but eventually pared it back to a system or a method that does not involve oil. In fact, there's no additives in it, and it works very well for us. And she's taught it to a lot of people, and that's been the finish on my instruments since about 1981 or 2.